Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Uncanny X-Men Issue 3, cover dated January of 1964. This issue marks the first appearance of longtime X-Men villain the Blob and was written by Stan Lee, drawn by Jack Kirby, inked by Paul Reinman, and lettered by Art Simek. Our story opens up with the X-Men diligently training in the Danger Room. Cyclops in particular has just finished using his optic beams to deflect heavy bags shot out of a mechanical ejector. Yet the other four X-Men weren't sitting idle, as Beast was the one loading the bags into the ejector, and Marvel Girl, Iceman and Angel were tasked with catching them after they had been deflected. Professor X commends Cyclops for his improved reaction speed and remarks that he's likely the most powerful of the X-Men. But despite how well he's training, Cyclops is unusually sullen, something that's worrying the professor. The young hero explains that he's in fear of his own power, afraid of what might happen if he loses control over his abilities. He even declares that sometimes he wishes he weren't a mutant at all. Marvel Girl is shocked by Cyclops' statement and tells her classmate to never say it again. Listening from afar is Iceman, who proudly declares that he's glad to be a mutant and have powers. It's also then that the immature teenager tears open one of the training bags over the Beast's head, pouring the sawdust within all over him. The Beast is actually allergic to sawdust, but only calmly rebukes Iceman for being so careless. The Angel sees this and thinks that the Beast is being too nice to their obnoxious teammate and decides to powerfully hurl a training bag at Iceman in retribution. The bag slides right under Iceman's feet and knocks him over, but of course the ice-cold X-Man isn't one to turn the other cheek, so he sends a torrent of snowballs at the Angel, which sticks his wings onto a nearby wall. The high-flying hero warns Iceman of the punishment he's due for, but then Cyclops steps in and rightly points out that the Angel really isn't much of a threat to the Iceman, not when he can't even thaw out his own wings without help. But by now, Professor X has had enough of his students fighting and orders them to stop and watch as Marvel Girl completes her psionic trial. Hers is one of dexterity, as she needs to telekinetically force a wooden block through the various shapes of a metal rack. She begins her time test and remarks that it's rather simple. But Professor X silences her and explains that the trial is not meant to gauge her power, but how quick and skillful she can be using her abilities. Thus Marvel Girl finishes in record time and is commended by the professor. But right at that moment the powerful telepath's thoughts are disturbed by the detection of another nearby mutant. He commands his students to clear their minds of any mental interference as he attempts to pinpoint the mutant's location. They oblige and he's successfully able to track down the mutant, but only to the specific town in which he lives. So the professor orders his students to change into plain clothes and get ready to search the town. The issue then shifts forward a few minutes later and into the living area of the four male X-Men. There, Warren asks Hank why he's so rushed to get dressed, as their mission doesn't seem to be an emergency. Hank responds by claiming that the first of them to report for their mission gets to escort Jean into town. Thus the girl crazy Bobby suddenly appears and rushes to be the first. Hank chases after him and passes by the stoic Scott, who silently admits that he also has feelings for Jean, but wouldn't dare act on them in fear of his powers hurting her. Yet it's not just the teenage boys that harbor feelings for the girl, but even the professor himself, who also silently admits that he loves her, but recognizes the inappropriate nature of a would-be relationship. But in any case, he then releases his X-Men to split up and head for town. Yet despite what Hank said, Jean decides that she wants to search with Scott. But as the pair head outside to leave, Warren suddenly swoops in and snatches Jean off of her feet and into his sports car. Jean hardly protests as she and Warren hurriedly speed away, leaving Scott, Bobby and Hank bitter and jealous. Yet the mission must go on, so a short time later all five of the X-Men are in the town searching for the mysterious mutant. Bobby is the first to think he's found them, as he comes across a man who's seemingly burning a piece of paper with a beam of energy emitted from his hand. But when he gets closer, Bobby realizes that the man is just using a small magnifying glass. Thus it's the Beast who next thinks he's found the mutant, as he sees a man seemingly standing on the air itself, several stories up a skyscraper. So the ape-like Beast removes his shoes and walks up the building to get a better look. But he's also mistaken, as the man standing on air is actually just a laborer working atop the glass case of a yet installed billboard. With this lead going nowhere, the issue then shifts focus to Scott, who's searching around the circus. He seems to be in the right place, as Professor X telepathically tells him that the mutant's mental signature is strong in the area. Searching around, Scott stumbles on a performer with perfect aim, who's not even looking at his target. Scott thinks that this performer might be the one they're searching for, but discovers that his act is nothing more than a trick, as hiding underneath his booth is a young boy who's actually hitting the target. While this lead is a dud, Scott's next one is more promising, as he hears a pitchman loudly advertise the circus's main attraction, a man called the Blob. Scott joins a crowd of people waiting for the Blob to perform, and receives a mental message from Professor X confirming that he's the mutant they're searching for. Now all Scott needs to do is wait for an opportunity to speak to the Blob. But the mutant must first perform. Starting his act, the Blob remains completely still and silent. Instead, an announcer calls for volunteers from the crowd and offers $100 to any that can move him. Scott and several other men take up the offer, but none of them, nor them combined, can even budge the Blob. They're then ushered off the stage as a rifle-carrying cowboy steps in. The announcer confidently declares that the cowboy is going to shoot the Blob to no effect whatsoever. And so he does, sending a volley of bullets towards the mutant. But to the crowd it seems that the Blob wasn't even hit and start demanding a refund. Yet they soon realize that the bullets had indeed hit the performer, but they'd sunk so far into his malleable flesh that they seem to have vanished. The Blob then finishes his act by expanding his chest, which sends the sunken bullet springing off of his elastic skin. With his act over, the Blob leaves and retires for the day to his trailer. Scott approaches the performer there and greets him rather cordially. But the Blob isn't one for pleasantries and manages to insult him in a crude response. Regardless, Scott asks the Blob if he's heard of the X-Men, which the circus performer has, but he evidently doesn't seem to hold the team in high regard, as he calls them a bunch of jerky juveniles in corny costumes. By this point Scott's lost any of his own regard for the Blob and plainly tells the mutant that he's been sent to bring him to the X-Men, and adds a thinly veiled threat by saying that the team doesn't take no for an answer. But the Blob hardly seems to care and rudely tells his visitor to get lost, lest he force him out. Yet Scott doesn't have a chance to respond, as Warren and Jean then arrive and apologize for their classmate's stiffness. The Blob takes only a single glance at Jean and is immediately smitten by her. He rises out of his seat and remarks that he'll come see the X-Men if she's coming too. He then rather creepily grabs a hold of Jean's arm, which both Warren and Scott don't react well to. While Warren simply tells the Blob to let go, Scott goes a step further and blasts the massive mutant with an optic beam, sending him crashing into a stove. Jean tells off Scott for being so rough, but as the Blob recovers he tells her that it's alright, as he's really just a fun-loving kid at heart and nothing can even hurt him anyways. But this remark isn't so innocent, as the mighty mutant says it while intimidatingly snuffing out the flame on one of the oven's burning logs. But in any case, the Blob agrees to visit the X-Men, and we next see him in the danger room with Professor X and the team, testing the limits of his power. The Blob proves just how unmovable he is, as when the professor attempts to hoist him up using a weighted chain, the chain violently snaps while the Blob remains motionless. Professor X marvels at the young mutant's power and explains that it's rooted in his ability to mentally control the very molecules of his body. But all the Blob hears is that he's terrific and rudely remarks that he didn't need some fancy scientific explanation to know that. Iceman overhears this disrespect and thinks that the Blob ought to be humbled. He asks the professor for permission to show him that he's not the only one among them who's terrific. Professor X allows this, and thus Iceman freezes the Blob's feet as the first demonstration of his power and to keep him still. Yet the Blob isn't impressed by Iceman's trick and effortlessly shatters his ice-cold shackle by merely wiggling his big toe. With this incredible display of power, Professor X is convinced that the Blob is a mutant and thus extends an offer for him to join the X-Men. But to the surprise of the professor, Blob declines, claiming that he's not going to let himself get bossed around by a team whose combined power he alone exceeds. But as Cyclops mentioned when he first met the Blob, the X-Men don't take no for an answer. So Professor X orders his students to subdue the Blob and take him to their laboratory, where he can erase his memories of them and their identities. Thus the Angel is the first to strike, flying towards the Blob and landing a powerful punch. But of course the blow has no effect on the bulletproof Blob, who uses Angel as a human shield, preventing Cyclops from blasting him with his optic beams. Then with startling speed, the massive mutant powerfully hurls the Angel into Cyclops, knocking them both out of the fight. Iceman then tries to strike their foe with a snowblast, but the Blob's faster than he'd seem, and Iceman misses. The Blob next turns his attention to Professor X. He lunges at the feeble man, but luckily Marvel Girl is able to telekinetically push the professor out of harm's way. With that, the Blob's had enough of fighting and heads for the door to escape. But Marvel Girl telekinetically shuts it before he can run through, seemingly trapping him inside. Thus it's the Beast who next steps up to tackle their enemy as he powerfully rams himself headfirst into the Blob. But like the mighty mutant had said, nothing can hurt him. All the blow does is crash the two through the door, giving the Blob an opportunity to escape while the Beast reels with a massive headache. And so a few minutes later, the X-Men have all recovered without any serious injuries. But perhaps the most distraught of them is the Professor, who's rebuking himself for allowing the Blob to learn his team's secrets. He'd simply assumed that the young mutant would accept the offer to join the X-Men, as all before him have. But of course the Blob didn't, and now all that he's worked for is in jeopardy. Thus the Professor has no choice but to telepathically erase the information from the mutant's mind. Yet it must be done in person, and so the Blob must somehow be drawn back to the X-Mansion. With that, the issue suddenly shifts focus to the massive mutant himself, who's returned to the circus. The Blob realizes that by knowing the secret identities of the X-Men, he's a threat to the team, and concludes that unless he defeats them first, they'll never rest until they've captured him. So the Blob begins scheming to do just that. Defeat the X-Men. He barges into the office of the circus's manager, declaring that he's now in control. The manager really has no choice, and acquiesces to the will of the mighty mutant, who orders him to wrangle all of the circus's performers together. And so he does, as a few minutes later we see the Blob standing atop a stage, surrounded by all of his former peers. The Blob announces his new command of the circus, and of his plan to defeat the X-Men. But his speech is interrupted by the arrival of the Angel, flying high above the performers. The Blob orders his new henchman to shoot down the hero, but the X-Man's long hours of practice in the danger room have paid off, as he's able to dodge all of their bullets. But now that he's been spotted, there's no use in sticking around, so the Angel returns to Professor X and tells him of the Blob's plan to attack. But the Professor had seen this coming, and is working on a device that can amplify his mental waves, enough that he can erase the memories of the entire circus. But seeing as he's busy with the device, he orders the Angel to warn his teammates of the coming battle. So the obedient student rushes out of the Professor's laboratory and first runs into the Beast, who's studying a textbook on advanced calculus. Our first hint that the apish teenager may be more sophisticated than he looks. But in any case, the Angel next warns Iceman, who was also supposed to be studying, but evidently was using his alone time to make an ice cream sundae. Yet just as the Angel leaves to warn the others, a giraffe suddenly crashes its head through a nearby window. Iceman pushes the animal away using a mop and peers outside to see that the Blob's arrived with his army of circus performers. Their first move is to crash a large battering ram through the X-Mansion's main door. But only moments before the ram is about to hit the door, Marvel Girl politely opens it for the intruders. Yet they don't remain inside for long, as Cyclops had been waiting for them. He quickly blasts them back outside, but the mansion is a large building, and the Blob orders his henchmen to break in from the many side entrances and windows. Thus a pair of acrobats have climbed atop a nearby street lamp and fashioned a makeshift tightrope using a grappling hook. The two begin walking across the rope to break into a multi-story window, but luckily the ape-like beast arrives just in time. He amazingly balances himself on the rope with nothing but his head and crashes the two acrobats into a rifleman perched atop the street lamp. But several other armed henchmen are on the ground below and are ordered by the Blob to shoot down the beast. Yet the hero effortlessly dodges their bullets. He even sings a jolly tune as he slides down the lamp to confront the Blob. Yet the evil mutant isn't interested in a rematch and instead releases a gorilla to battle the beast. The Angel then arrives to help his teammate, but suddenly a lasso-whirling cowboy appears and tries to wrangle the high-flying hero. But the Angel is too fast for the cowboy and slips right out of his trap. Yet he isn't fast enough to dodge a pair of human cannonballs, who tackle him in midair. Cyclops, Iceman and Marvel Girl race to save the Angel, but they're stopped dead in their tracks by a massive elephant. The animal's mahout brags that his beast is too big for any of them to handle, But Cyclops quickly proves him wrong as he adjusts the intensity of his visor and blasts the elephant dozens of feet away. Yet the blast's high intensity weakens Cyclops, leaving it up to Iceman and Marvel Girl to defeat two incoming henchmen. But just as Iceman prepares to hurl an ice torpedo at them, two more goons in insulated suits sneak up from behind and tackle him. Their suits render the hero's powers useless, leaving Marvel Girl alone against the Blob's army. Her prospects seem slim as the issue shifts focus to the Professor, who recognizes that his team does possess the power to defeat the circus, but still lacks the skill. Regardless, he returns to tinkering with his device as the issue shifts back to the embattled X-Men, and more specifically Iceman and Marvel Girl, who have been subdued by the Blob's goons and are being tied up. The Blob himself confidently declares that he's defeated the X-Men, but even one of his henchmen thinks he's spoken too soon, as Cyclops has regained his strength and suddenly breaks free of the net he'd been restrained in. The hero then rushes to battle the Blob, but the evil mutant disregards his power, as now that he's aware of it, he cannot be knocked down like he had been when they first met. Cyclops admits that the Blob is right, but simply blasts at the ground beneath him, uprooting the massive mutant and knocking him down. Yet in his haste to defeat the Blob, Cyclops fails to notice two henchmen who sneak up from behind and place a sack over his head. With it covered, the hero isn't able to manipulate his visor or shoot his beams. But in that moment the Angel manages to wrestle free from his captors, although only for a few seconds, as a henchman is able to fully restrain the hero's wings with a skillful lasso toss. And so only one X-Man remains, the Beast, who's finally bested the gorilla. Thus he, like Cyclops before him, rushes to defeat the Blob. He's easily able to leap over several goons to get to him, but stumbles while trying to pass through a human pyramid. The slip-up causes his aim to be off, and he lands right into the grasp of the Blob, who powerfully pins him to the ground. And so a few minutes later, the Blob reunites the 5 X-Men, all of whom are tied up. He commands them to stay put as he and his goons head into the mansion. Still inside is Professor X, who's waiting patiently for the Blob's arrival. Yet in the meantime he sends a mental message to Marvel Girl, reminding her that she can telekinetically remove the blindfold she's wearing, as apparently she forgot her own superpower. Regardless, the Professor then directs her attention to a nearby circus trailer full of throwing knives, one of which she telekinetically retrieves and uses to cut the ropes that are restraining her and her teammates. The issue then shifts back to the Blob, who's found Professor X in his laboratory. The evil mutant orders his henchmen to attack, but before any of them can take another step, a thick wall of ice suddenly blocks their path. The Blob realizes that the X-Men have escaped their bonds, but before he can order his henchmen to defeat the team once more, all of the goons are enveloped in a large sheet of canvas manipulated by Marvel Girl. So now it's just the Blob versus the X-Men. But there's hardly any fighting, as Cyclops simply blasts the ground beneath the villain, trapping him in a deep hole. Yet more of the Blob's goons have arrived, and so the X-Men do see some action after all. The Angel is the first to strike, as he swoops down towards the henchmen and uses his wings to knock their weapons out of their hands. Cyclops then steps in and uses a low-intensity beam to corral the goons into one spot. It's then that Professor X finally activates his mind-amplifying device and erases the memories of the Blob and the rest of the circus. And thus the mighty mutant confusedly emerges from his hole without any knowledge of the epic battle that had just taken place. The X-Men then thank the Professor for saving the day, but he gives his team the credit they're due, for he wouldn't have been able to use his device if not for the time they gave him while battling the Blob. With that, the issue subsequently ends as we see the Blob back in the circus, performing as though nothing had happened. And so everything is back to normal, although the Professor knows that the mind of a mutant is an unpredictable thing, and the Blob's memories may very well return one day. That concludes Uncanny X-Men Issue 3, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a solid story, and a notable improvement over last issue. Compared to the Vanisher, the Blob was a legitimately menacing villain with an actual personality, whose motivation to defeat the X-Men had some depth. Speaking of the team, I also appreciated that this issue devoted more time to the heroes as people, such as establishing that the Beast is brainy, or that the Angel is rich. Professor X in particular received some much-needed depth. The last 2 issues honestly didn't endear me to the character. He's just been too stoic and overbearing towards his students. But in this story we see him make a mistake and become angry with himself, something I think we can all relate to. Him loving Jean is pretty weird though, and I hope that story thread is dropped sooner rather than later. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.